I would propose that we have a 10-15 minutes discussion now on certain topics, and it will only work if we take our questions as a question serious, which means short, crisp, and understandable. Who would like to start? Yes, please. I think you have to... Yes, micro is coming.
Thank you. Very nice.
Thank you, Mr. President. Andreas Follestal from the Norwegian Academy of Arts and Letters, and in this connection, principal investigator of an advanced ERC grant. I would like to stress the importance of thinking about synergy between the European funding bodies and the national in particular, that was stressed by Professor Cloetingh, that there's a risk that the domestic funding bodies become satellites of a European body, and I think this is just, there's a risk that is serious enough to consider, but not to completely reject suggestions, for instance, of reusing ERC applications, as was mentioned, and urge domestic bodies to fund those that would have been funded had the ERC had enough funding, but to make sure that there's enough funding to allow the national research priorities to continue, because there's a risk, a serious risk, that the ERC research agenda would overtake or overwhelm the domestic. And there would be two examples, for instance. One is that there'd be an undue focus then on European-wide or comparative issues, rather than those that are genuinely of interest, but mainly for a domestic audience. And secondly, for instance, in the advanced grants, rather than compared to the starting grants, the funding explicitly looks for impact beyond any specific research domain, which is of course important, but should not be a necessary condition for all excellent research in Europe. And so I think this kind of critical reflexivity, to repeat the phrase of a previous speaker, is extremely important, especially in a Europe undergoing an economic crisis. And my sense is that ALLEA and Academy Europæa are uniquely situated to host those sorts of reflections about combining rather than letting the domestic be overwhelmed by the European. Thank you.
Thank you. Sierd, would you like to start?
Yes. I think it is an important issue, the synergy and the harmony between what is done in the member states and what is done on the European level. What is important to realize that to be successful in the ERC, of course, homework is needed also very much on the national level. It's very clear that those countries that have invested in the past have created a competitive research environment with open review, international review systems, produce more successful applicants to ERC. It is also important, of course, to realize that a number of national research councils take the grantees that have not been funded by ERC due to limited budget but got an A, that means an excellent in their evaluation, talk these evaluations and say, okay, we step in and we pick up the bill. Of course, it is important also to mention here the benchmarking effect of the ERC, but there will always be a strong responsibility for the member states to do their own job. And as Mrs. Carvalho has mentioned, close to 90% of the research money in Europe is spent by the individual countries. Of course, we need more coordination here. In my field, this Topo Europe was a Euro course. Such an instrument does not exist anymore. There is a gap. Again, I don't see a contradiction here. We need successes on the European level, and ERC is one of those successes, but not the only one. Marie Curie is also a tremendous success. ESFRI is a very big success, and there are many more. And at the same time, of course, we need continuous investments in the member states. And in this case, it takes two to go for tango, both European level and what is done in the different countries.
Dr. Carvalho.
Thank you very much. It is a question to Professor Salema. When you talk about standards, you mention European standards. It's a very important topic when we are negotiating, for example, the TTIP with the US. Our aim is to have common standards with our neighbors and with our partners like the US. What is your opinion? I know that there is a big discussion on telecommunications, but I don't know if you have a short answer for that. Thank you.
Thank you. The problem is the US will always defend their own industry. And that has happened in the mobile communications. They decided not to adopt the GSM standard. They adopted their own, which is not a bad standard, but it's different. It's their own standard. Now, on digital television, it's even worse. They adopted what I call a bad standard, because they could not adopt the European standard, because which is a fairly good standard, has been adopted in many, many, many cases, because they want to protect their own industry. Besides the standards, which should be pretty much open, there are always a few patents, important patents, here and there. And then those interests, I think my colleague on my left has mentioned those before, they play a very important role. And sometimes you don't get uniform standards. That's it. Yet GSM has quite a good coverage in the United States, but not. It's not the only one. There are more than that.
Thank you. Yes, please. Micro.
Ali Alpar from the Science Academy in Turkey. My question is to Professor Soromenho-Marques. In your conclusions, you mentioned more science in policy and a more enlightened democratic citizenship. Could you comment on the ways to engage and develop such a political climate with the citizenship?
Thank you very much. Indeed, there are different areas in which we may design politically the participation of citizens in science. One area would be the discussion regarding the implementation of scientific technological projects. So the need, for instance, in the environmental area, we have all over Europe the environmental assessment, in which there is a huge, in many member countries, huge participation of the public opinion, NGOs, and so on. But I think that it's not just a matter of a case-by-case approach. I think that we need also, and the academies of sciences are also a play in that field, we need also to rethink what we understand by the role of science in public culture, public education, public policy. I think that we have a long way to perform in Europe as well in the world, in the sense that we need to put science and technology in the agenda of the public space, and starting also at school. Sometimes at schools we don't deal with the social dimension of the application of science and the ethical consequences of that. So I think this is a very important discussion in a broader international perspective, not just European. I think that, I was with Graça Carvalho many years ago engaged in the process of climate change in Europe regarding the preparation of the summit in Copenhagen in 2009, and we had the opportunity to discuss with colleagues in India, in China, and other countries the impact of science and technology, and I think that we have people all over the world eager to understand more about what is science about, what are the consequences of science, and also why it's so important to have political decisions about science.
You mentioned that state power is decreasing. Do you believe that the occurrence and the whatever NGOs are helping, or are rather the opposite? What would be the solution for that?
Well, in the case of Europe, I think that we have we are in a transition period. If we look to economy, to public finance, I think that there is no such fear of having a kind of science being exclusively funded by the EU, because we have an imbalance so huge. We should not neglect that we have 45% of GDP in Europe is public expense national budget, 45, and we have just 1% of GDP, Europe GDP, in EU. So there is a huge imbalance. The funding of science, the public funding of science, both at national and EU level, it's very important to provide stimulus for communities, scientific communities, for countries that are lagging behind. That's very important. But indeed, Professor Günter Stock, President Günter, you asked me in a broader perspective. I think that what we are now needing in Europe is to fulfill the gap, because we have European-wide problems in every areas, from science to environment to economy, so social security, welfare state, and so on. And we don't have an European scale. So I would say that we need, of course, NGOs, citizens being active, we need the national public policies, but we need more Europe, meaning a more budget for the European Union, political leaders that are elected by citizens, and the feeling that if we have an European dimension in crisis, we need to have an European scale of decision to face that.
Thank you. I think now we should go for lunch, but before doing so, let me say, Professor Barras, if you agree that we start 10 minutes or something later, because two of the contributors will not be there in the afternoon. But we have an invitation. You have now three options. One is we have lunch and lunch only. Second option, instead of lunch, you can visit the museum. We are invited to the Academy's museum. And there is something in between. Don't take your lunch, but you can combine lunchtime and going to the museum, and we will see how it works. So enjoy the break and see you in 1 hour. Thank you.